Welcome to episode 158 of This Week in Linux, your weekly source for Linux GNews. From the Destination Linux Network, I'm Michael Tennell. If you're new to the show, this is a podcast that will keep you up to date with what's going on in the Linux world, and I'll give you my take as a 20-year plus Linux user. Coming up on this week's episode, we're going to be covering a lot of stuff, including one of the most important, if not the most important project related to this show, the Linux Kernel with release of Linux 5.13. Then we'll check out the latest releases of Pipewire, as well as others applications like Darktable, Ardour, Tux Paint, and NeoVim. Plus, we've got a ton of distro news this week, with PopOS 2104 being released, as well as some news about CentOS, Deepin Linux, and ChimeraOS. All that and so much more coming up right now on this week's episode of TWIL, your weekly source for Linux GNews. The first topic for this week is about one of the most important pieces of the puzzle for this show to even exist, which is, of course, the Linux kernel. Linux kernel 5.13 has been released. Of course, we won't be able to go through all of it because there's a lot of stuff in this release, but we'll cover some of the highlights for it. And if you want to get more info about that, I'll leave a link in the show notes. You know the drill. So the highlights for this release, first, they have initial support for the Apple M1 SoC, although this support is still early work in progress kind of thing with no mainline support just yet for the Apple M1 GPU, but there's a lot of work going into this, and it is great to see that they are making progress and as quickly as they are, because that is awesome. Now, we've talked about this on Destination Linux as for like why the Apple M1 support is important. If you want to find out more about that, I'll have a link in the show notes. Also in this release, the Landlock's Linux security module has been merged after years of development for allowing unprivileged application sandboxing. So the goal of Landlock is to enable to restrict rights for like global file system access and that sort of stuff for a set of processes. So because Landlock is a stackable LSM, it makes it possible to create safe security sandboxes as new security layers in addition to the existing system-wide access controls. This kind of sandbox is expected to help mitigate the security impacts of bugs or unexpected malicious behaviors of user space applications, because it allows it to basically make any process, including unprivileged ones, be able to securely restrict themselves with a sort of sandbox, which is really cool. Also in this release is the AMD GPU FreeSync HDMI support is now mainline for allowing FreeSync on HDMI. Previously, you would have to use DisplayPort, but now you can use the HDMI to get FreeSync, which is awesome. A new Intel cooling driver has also been added to allow downclocking to the CPU at a lower temperature threshold than the system default. And we also have some other stuff like, this is really interesting because there's a new generic USB display driver that was added for use cases like turning a Raspberry Pi Zero into a USB-based display adapter. And there's also many other things you can do with this new driver. We also have now support for Amazon's Luna game controller, which is now supported by the XPad driver. And we've got so much more, including the Clang Control Flow Integrity Support, or CFI, for the mainline kernel for enhancing security with only minor runtime overhead. The compiler injects a runtime check before each indirect function call to ensure that the target is a valid function in the correct static type. This restricts possible call targets and makes it more difficult for an attacker to exploit bugs that allow for the modification of like function pointers and that sort of stuff, which is really interesting because that's what the control flow integrity part is. We talked about it previously on this show as well. I'll have a link in that in the show notes if you want to learn more about the CFI structure. And there's also so much more on this. This is just the highlights, but there's a ton of great information, and we'll have a link to the Kernel Newbies page because it's a very in-depth breakdown of what's all in the latest release of 5.13. So if you'd like to learn more and check out the changelog for yourself, you'll find links in the show notes. We've talked about Pipewire on previous episodes of TWIL on multiple occasions, such as when Fedora announced they were shipping Pipewire by default in Fedora Linux 34. And also, we're going to talk about a little bit more with this latest release of Pipewire 0.3.31. It adds a lot of new improvements and features. For example, in this release, there are new Pulse audio modules ported over. The jack support has seen massive stability improvements. A Bluetooth hardware database has been added, which is very cool because it makes it possible to now disable non-working features on specific devices based on checking that database. And there's, of course, many other changes throughout the code base, like bug fixes and that sort of thing. But Pipewire is something that is very exciting to me because it's one of those low-level things that most people don't know about, or some people might not even want to know about. But I am very interested in Pipewire because it is such a powerful thing. It's going to be not necessarily replacing other audio server stuff, but in the future it probably will at some point. But it is a very cool thing because it allows you to have the simplistic aspect of audio servers where you just start the computer and it gets all the audio working and that sort of stuff. But it also has the pro level stuff, which is very interesting. But there's a lot to talk about, and it requires a lot more time to be devoted to it in order to break it down. So with that said, if you'd like to learn more about Pipewire, then be sure to check out the next episode of Destination Linux podcast, where we talk about Pipewire in much more depth. We're going to break down all the pieces that are interesting to me at least, and a lot more. So you'll find links to the latest release in the show notes for Pipewire, Pipewire 0.3.31. And also be sure to join us live on Sunday, July 4th to see the Pipewire fireworks on Destination Linux. And if you can't join us live, that's fine too. So the show will be published shortly thereafter, so you'll find links on this show to the episode published for DL as well if you want to check it out, and also on the Destination Linux Network YouTube/Odyssey channels. PopOS 2104 has been released and is based on the Ubuntu 2104 release. PopOS 2104 comes 2 months after the release of Ubuntu 2104, and if you aren't aware, the reason for this additional time is because of the Cosmic Desktop. Back in episode 147 of TWIL, I introduced you to the new Cosmic Desktop from System76. At the time, it wasn't ready for use, but if you are one of those people who want a desktop environment that has a tiling focus, by default, then check out PopOS 2104 because Cosmic is ready to blast off. Get it? Blast off? Okay, fine. Anyway, Cosmic, which stands for Computer Operating System Main Interface Components, which is very likely that they chose those words to really spell out Cosmic. But fair enough, it's a nice acronym, or backronym in this case. Cosmic is built around GNOME Shell 3.38, but it isn't necessarily a full-blown fork of GNOME. It's more like an enhancement layer sitting on top of GNOME, which is very cool. The highlights of the Cosmic Desktop include a fully customizable dock, split activities overview into workspaces and application views, so you can quickly launch into either one of those with a shortcut, the ability to open the launcher with a super key, as well as the various trackpad gestures, and even there's trackpad gestures to be able to go from not only just workspaces, but also which application is active in the tiling functionality, which is very, very cool. And another big difference between Cosmic and GNOME is the PopShell tiling Windows functionality. So tiling Windows managers are quite popular with a lot of people, and Cosmic is a pretty good way to try it out for someone who's never, tried the tiling concept, because it allows you to, try it out without having to jumping right into the deep end with all the other options, because it kind of gives you like a gradual, you still have a DE, but you also have tiling functions. Now, there are other desktop environments that have tiling, but they're not as in-depth in terms of focusing on the tiling parts. So there you go. And to quote System76 with this announcement of the latest release, the new Cosmic workflow introduced in PopOS 2104 is the culmination of years of user research and feedback. We've streamlined launching and switching between applications and made the interface simpler and more straightforward while introducing numerous options to adjust the desktop to personal taste. Now, this is really interesting because the way that they have structured the layout of it is similar to GNOME 40, but it's not based on GNOME 40. So they did say that they're going to be, supporting GNOME 40 going forward. So like the 2110 release is planned to have a GNOME 40 support. So it's interesting that they've already kind of adopted the GNOME 40 layout sort of in this context. Now, it's not completely adopted it, but it's just like the structure of how the dock is built and the bottom center layout and that sort of thing. But anyway, PopOS 2104 also comes with the ability to upgrade the recovery partition, an improved search feature, and something that some GNOME enthusiasts may consider blasphemous. But the option to have minimize and maximize buttons on application windows. I know, right? How could they? So PopOS is a very compelling Linux distribution that has a lot of cool ideas. I especially like the idea of the DE with a full-blown tiling windows function. A lot of DEs have it, like I said, but in a more limited capacity. So it's cool to see System76 working on that. And I will say, I do think it's slightly unfortunate that they don't have a KDE Plasma edition called K-Pop, but maybe someday. If you'd like to learn more about the Cosmic Desktop or try out PopOS 2104 for yourself, then you'll find links in the show notes. This episode of This Week in Linux is brought to you by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean recently announced their new Managed MongoDB service, which is a fully managed database as a service, or DBAS or AAS. I like to say it as DBOS, but With Managed MongoDB, you can focus more on building scalable, high-performance apps and less on maintaining those databases. Simply offload your MongoDB administration to DigitalOcean and let them handle the provisioning, managing, scaling, updates, backups, and security of your clusters. DigitalOcean built this service in partnership with MongoDB Inc., and together they have ensured that you will get access to all the latest releases of the MongoDB document database as they become available. As a listener of This Week in Linux podcast and a member of the DLN community, you can get started for free. Actually, better than free, because DigitalOcean is giving you a $100 free credit when you go to do.co/DLN-Mongo. For those who have listened to the show for any length of time, you'll notice that the URL is slightly different, and that is make sure that you are using that link for going forward for those who are interested in the Mongo services. So go to do.co/DLN-Mongo to get that $100 free credit on DigitalOcean's new Managed MongoDB service. And we want to thank DigitalOcean for sponsoring this episode of This Week in Linux. Up next in the show is Deepin Linux. Deepin Linux is a distro that has a lot of people talking about it, whether that's on the positive side for the attention to detail on their design, or on the negative side due to its origin. It's certainly a distro that has caught the eye of many people. And this latest release of Deepin Linux is 20.2.2, and this version number implies a small maintenance release, but there's quite a bit to this release. Deepin Linux has introduced many new features in this release, including a new app store. This new app store offers better app management with support for batch installation of applications. I don't know if most package managers are able to do that, but I don't know of any stores that can do batch installs. Batch updates, yes, but batch installs, I don't know of any. But as a fresh new design also included in this new app store. And Deepin also made it easier to discover different types of applications by improving the layout of content, such as optimizing categories and updating the sorting by making it possible to sort ranked listings by ratings, most downloads, and most recently updated. Also, with this new app store, they have added the ability to install Android apps. They say that it's basically using a container, and they say that also the Android apps containers only work right now for the 5.10 kernel edition. There's also another option for people who want to use the 5.12 version, but that does not have support for the Android. They're still working on that, but that's there you go. But unfortunately, information about how they did this Android app support is not readily available. At least not that I could find, but based on the note about Android containers, I assume it's using Anbox to facilitate that. And if you learn more about Anbox, I'll have a link in the show notes for that. Deepin Linux is now more secure thanks to the secure boot support, which makes the system only boot on a signed kernel. According to the developers, Deepin Linux is the first Chinese distribution to have obtained a secure boot certificate. So Deepin Linux 20 series introduced a new dual kernel feature to let you choose the Linux kernel for your needs right from the bootloader. So this means that you'll be able to choose between the LTS version of the kernel and also one of the latest versions, which is in this case the 5.10 LTS and the 5.12 series for better hardware support. And I think Deepin Linux is a very interesting distribution because they have so much attention to detail when it comes to the design of their apps, especially the App Store. It's one of the best looking app stores in the Linux ecosystem. However, they seem to have heavily been inspired by macOS of late, which for me is a kind of a miss because Big Sur is probably one of the worst looking versions of macOS in a while, in my opinion. But, there you go. The version of Deepin before the Big Sur sort of looking thing was much better, in my opinion, so maybe food for thought for the Deepin developers. If you'd like to learn more about Deepin Linux or check it out for yourself, the links will be in the show notes. Enterprise Linux has historically not been a subject that has garnered a ton of attention outside of the enterprise world. It's a very important subject, but it's not, something that is often talked about, when it comes to people talking about things that are happening in that enterprise space. But with CentOS, that has completely changed. It seems like every week there's something new and exciting happening with the enterprise Linux space because of the changes that happened in late 2020. For this recent example, like whether Alma Linux 8.4 being ready for ARM or Red Hat's announcing of Rail for free for individuals, it just keeps getting more and more interesting as it goes. And this week is no exception to that because there is an exciting initiative that has been underway within the CentOS camp, and it's basically a special interest group for CentOS Hyperscale. So CentOS Hyperscale is very interesting because it has developers from many organizations, including engineers from Twitter and Facebook, along with many others. They've been working on progress of offering their hyperscaler-focused packages and updates, and even on to publishing a CentOS Hyperscale Workstation OS image for testing. So the CentOS Hyperscaler effort has been working on better fitting CentOS Stream to modern enterprise needs, and via their repository working on things like backporting systemd versions and other key packages into CentOS Stream. So this week the SIG or the CentOS Hyperscale Special Interest Group published their Q2 2021 progress report. In this progress report, they noted that the most recent backport of systemd for 248 and also they have updates for the non-modular build of LLVM 12 is available until a modular version is offered in CentOS Stream, which is being worked on. And there's also updates for DNF and RPM setup, with having Btrfs copy on write support, which is awesome because we've talked about Btrfs. I'm actually working on a video about Btrfs on this channel coming soon, but Btrfs is a really, really interesting file system. But also moving on to the kernel side of the things, so the Hyperscale SIG is currently tracking the Linux 5.12 kernel for use on CentOS. But what's really interesting about this is that they have now added a modified version of Kpatch for live kernel patching of the CentOS streams, which is really, really interesting. And that's not all, because CentOS Hyperscale Group has also published an experimental OS image. It is in the very early stages of it, as indicated by the experimental aspect, but it is very interesting because they're making a lot of progress very quickly on this hyperscale approach. So looking ahead, the developers and engineers are looking at making a live media image more ready for broader consumption, as well as integrating Btrfs transactional updates as an optional feature, which I'm very interested in because having an enterprise distribution with also having Btrfs built in for the transactional updates and basically snapshots as well would be theoretically possible, would be very, very interesting. And basically, I think that, it'd be a kind of like a game changer for the enterprise world with that sort of stuff being implemented. So I think it's very interesting, as well as they also are doing hyperscaled enabled cloud images and so much more. I've been working on a video related to this sort of topic, the CentOS drama or whatever you want to call it. And it seems like I'll need to go back and make some changes to that video because of this new news. Basically, every few weeks, there's a new change to make it. So that's why the video hasn't come out yet, because there's new changes with Alma Linux and CentOS Linux and Rail making new announcements and all sorts of stuff. And I'm trying to keep it all together, but it just keeps rolling on. So I might have to just say okay, here's a cutoff point. And let's just go with it. But anyway, if you're interested in that sort of stuff, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the release of the CentOS saga, Keeping It Rail, or whatever I actually call it. I might even call it that. I don't know. But anyway, you'll also find links for this CentOS Hyperscale effort in the show notes below. Up next in the show, we got some more distro news, and in this case, it's ChimeraOS 25 has been released. Now, ChimeraOS is a gaming-related distro, and gaming is a very important piece to the Linux ecosystem, whether you're a gamer or not. It's very important because keeping up with gaming means better performance, better hardware support, and so much more. This is why ChimeraOS caught my attention. So ChimeraOS 25 has been released, and while it's the 25th release of the project, it's the first known as ChimeraOS. Previously, it was known as GamerOS. So ChimeraOS is an operating system that provides an out-of-the-box couch gaming experience. After installation, you boot directly into Steam's big picture mode, and you can start playing whatever game you want to. It's kind of like the spiritual successor to Valve's SteamOS. However, it's a lot more than just a SteamOS rebuild. For example, it has a built-in web app to manage installing non-Steam games known as SteamBuddy. This makes it possible to run games from GOG or GOG, emulators, and many other places. So this is a really interesting distribution because it's focused on not necessarily being a gaming distro, but more of a distro that is built for having creating your own consoles type of experience, and basically they call it a couch gaming experience. So the latest release of ChimeraOS 25 has kernel 5.12.12, Mesa 21.1.3. They have NVIDIA drivers for 465.31, SteamBuddy 0.11.2, which is their tool, SteamOS Compositor Plus with 1.8.3, and also there's a lot of other stuff that they've done in this change from GamerOS to ChimeraOS. For example, they added basic Mango HUD configuration support via SteamBuddy. So for those who are not familiar, Mango HUD is basically a heads-up display to give you details about your frames and that sort of stuff. Also, they've added racing wheel support. They've fixed Bluetooth pairing through Steam UI. They've added support for Proton 6.8 GE, 6.9 GE, and 6.10 GE. And if you don't know what that is, GE refers to the Glorious Eggroll branch of Proton, which is developed by a developer with the codename or pseudonym of Glorious Eggroll. And also they've added media key support as well as merged Steam tweaks into SteamBuddy. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in ChimeraOS, and including changing the whole name to ChimeraOS. And if you're interested in trying out a couch gaming experience, then maybe you'll want to check out ChimeraOS, and I'll have links in the show notes below. This episode of This Week in Linux is brought to you by Bitwarden. Bitwarden is an open source cross-platform password manager that can be used at home, on the go, or at work. A big challenge for businesses is whether or not their employees follow password management best practices. Bitwarden helps solve that because they can securely store credentials spanning across personal vaults or an organizational vault. So every Bitwarden account begins with the creation of a personal vault, which allows the user to store their own personal credentials, which also means that you can take this account and attach it to an organizational vault, meaning you can share credentials across many different types of people across your entire company, and it also gives quicker access, meaning quicker productivity. And also businesses will get a lot of benefit from using Bitwarden because Bitwarden is fully customizable. You can adjust features using enterprise policies to adapt to your business's needs, and also team members can generate unique and secure passwords for every account and every site that they sign up to, which is very important, and it's one of the biggest things about best practices for password security, because a lot of people tend to reuse passwords, and that is not good. But with Bitwarden, you can solve that problem. Also, you can customize and set password requirements as the business using administrative policies that will basically allow you to make sure that they have good password hygiene. You also get enterprise-grade security because Bitwarden conducts regular third-party security audits and is compliant with major privacy and security standards like GDPR, CCPA, HIPAA, and SOC 2. You can get up and running fast using Bitwarden's cloud as well and gain complete control with the self-hosted option, which is awesome. Bitwarden also just released a few new features, including Bitwarden Send, a fully encrypted method to transmit sensitive information, whether text or files, to anyone, which is a fantastic service, and I was super excited to see when they announced that. Bitwarden is awesome. So make the smart move like many from the community have and go to bitwarden.com/DLN to get the password manager that offers robust and cost-effective solution that can drastically increase your chances of staying safe online. Get started with the free Teams or Enterprise trials of a Teams or Enterprise plan, or try it for free across devices as an individual user by going to bitwarden.com/DLN. And thanks again to Bitwarden for sponsoring This Week in Linux. Up next in the show, let's talk about audio production, more specifically Ardour 6.8. Ardour 6.8 has been released, and for those unfamiliar, Ardour is a DAW or digital audio workstation, and it has been a prominent component in the open source music creation world for many years. Ardour 6.8 introduces a bunch of much needed new features to this already powerful DAW. These new features include support for importing M4A audio files, a new configurable remove gaps track edit operation with adjustable threshold and leave parameters, as well as the ability to display low-level metering of the digital signal processing or DSP info in the performance meters. This release also adds a configurable slip contents shortcut binding and preferences, a new track playlist menu for creating new playlists for tracks, support for requesting specific CPU DMA latency values, and 2 new operations for MIDI editing like the extend selection and the invert selection, and so much more. Now, if you don't know what those things mean, you join the club because I'm in that with you. There's a lot of those things that I've dabbled with Ardour over the years quite a bit, but in terms of like being expert, I would not remotely put myself in that field. But if you like to learn more about the latest release of Ardour with version 6.8, then you'll find links in the show notes. Up next in the show is an awesome application called Darktable. So Darktable is an open source cross-platform raw image editor for photographers. You can describe Darktable as an alternative to Adobe Lightroom, and some users of it think that it may even be better than Lightroom, which is really cool. So Darktable 3.6 has many improvements and new features in this latest release, including a full rework of the import module. Now this is really, really awesome because the new module allows you to see thumbnails of your images before you even import anything, and it makes it easier to handle multiple import tasks. The same dialog is used for importing from disk, card, and camera. And also when you import in place, like images that already exist on your like you already have, you're importing from some device or some card that you already have images that are on your disk for this kind of thing, it will detect them and see them as like a duplicate, and it will be flagged and automatically exclude them from the import, which is awesome because it allows you to better organize and deduplicate automatically without having to import and then do it after the fact, which is cool. Also, a vector scope has been added to complement the current histogram, waveform, and parade views for editing, and also there's a new default demosaic. I'm not sure I was supposed to say that word. Demosaic algorithm has been introduced, which should provide better quality than the current default PPG, which depending on if you use the Amaze, it has a little bit of a long runtime, so it'll improve the performance in that case. Also, there's support for dual demosaics as also being added to this latest release of Darktable 3.6, which allows you to combine stuff like RCD plus VNG4 or Amaze plus VNG4 for like Bayer sensors. This allows you to use an algorithm better resolving fine detail and another one delivering a smoother output depending on local image content. You can now create also an opacity mask based on the sharpness of an image, which allows you to be giving more fine details to your masking, and so much more. There's a lot of cool stuff, including like a new crop module. This new module is added to basically allow you to crop parts of the image for source spots in the retouch module stuff, and also many other things. But another one I wanted to talk about is the new color balance RGB module, because everybody knows RGB is very important. That's not what this is related to, but anyway, it's really good because this can be used as a one-stop module for all of the color grading work inside of your editing, which is just fantastic. And there is so much more in Darktable 3.6. If you'd like to learn more about this or get started with using Darktable, then you'll find links in the show notes. Up next in the show, we have some more image editing related sort of stuff, and that is Tux Paint 0.9.26 has been released. Tux Paint is a free drawing program for children ages 3 to 12, such as like preschool and K through 6 and that sort of stuff. Tux Paint is used in schools around the world as a computer literacy drawing activity. It combines a easy-to-use interface, fun sound effects, and an encouraging cartoon mascot who helps children use the program. So this is a really interesting application because essentially kids start with a blank canvas and they're provided with a bunch of drawing tools to help them learn the concept of creating it. And the Tux Paint 0.9.26 release introduces new magic tools, as they call them, magic tools. One of the tools is a checkerboard tool, which lets you essentially fill entire canvas with checkerboard pattern. There's also the clone tool, which helps kids duplicate parts of a picture by using brush strokes, and the pixels tool, which makes it easier for kids to create retro gaming style pixel art. Now, this new release also improves the fill tool with 2 new options that let kids do kind of like color gradients. So there's linear color gradient, which supports interactive creation of gradients on different angles and sizes, and the radial gradient, which creates a circular style of gradient that is centered around wherever you click the mouse. So also there's all the fill tools were updated in this release to better handle filling around anti-aliased edges and that sort of stuff. So plus, among other noteworthy changes, the UI buttons were made larger, the halftone magic tool was improved to load properly with its sound effects file, and there's some new functions added for the Magic Tools API. Now, Tux Paint also added several new accessibility options, which is really nice to see, one of which allows children to enlarge the entire user interface if they have vision issues and that sort of stuff. Another new accessibility option is it lets kids reorganize the color palette, which might come in handy if they use, depending on which kind of input devices they use. And it's really good to see this application putting some effort into accessibility options, because I think every application should really focus on accessibility. Now, a lot of projects don't think about it because it's not in their purview to notice that sort of thing that needs to be done. So anytime a project, like a distro, an application, or whatever works on accessibility, I always love to see that. So well done to Tux Paint for doing that. Now, Tux Paint is not the most modern design application out there, but its goal is to be easy for kids. I still kind of wonder, maybe it could use a new coat of Tux Paint. Well, Tux Paint is likely in your distribution's package manager, but depending on the speed of your distro, your release schedules, it may be out of date. Thankfully, though, there is a Flatpak option in the Flat Hub, so if you want to try out Tux Paint for yourself, you can get it from the Flat Hub. And so you'll find links for the Flatpak as well as the Tux Paint website's details for the latest release in the show notes below. From one kid-friendly application to another, let's talk about NeoVim, because NeoVim 0.5.0 has been released. And yes, I'm kidding. NeoVim is certainly not a child-oriented application. I just couldn't resist making the joke. So anyway, for those unfamiliar with NeoVim, it is a fork of Vim that is focused on extensibility and usability. So NeoVim team describes it as a project that seeks to aggressively refactor Vim in order to simplify maintenance and encourage contributions, split the work between multiple developers, enable advanced UIs without modifications to the core, maximize extensibility, and all sorts of stuff. And this NeoVim has a lot of interesting features, like it's an embeddable scriptable terminal emulator. It has asynchronous job control, shared data among multiple editor instances, XDG-based directory support, compatible with Vim plugins, including Ruby and Python plugins, and it has API access from basically any language, such as C, C++, C#, D, Go, Haskell, Java, Rust, Ruby, Python, Perl, Lua, so much stuff in there. You could pretty much use whatever you want. This release of 0.5.0 is basically 4,000 commits since the previous non-maintenance release, which was 0.4.4. And the highlights of this release include built-in support for LSP, new APIs for extended marks with byte resolution tracking of changes, and buffer decorations, as well as vast improvements to the Lua as a plugin and configuration language. So this is a kind of a I guess you could call it a hardcore style text editor that if you are wanting to, you need to use a very powerful text editor inside of a terminal, then NeoVim is definitely something to check out because it is in current terms of Vim and Emacs and that sort of stuff, NeoVim sits in a more actively, aggressively developed version of Vim. So you might be interested in checking it out if you are in need of that kind of tool. So it also added experimental support for Tree Sitter as a syntax engine, as also included in this latest release of 0.5.0. And also they've added new API functions like NVim exec, which is executing multiple line Vim script blocks. You can do NVim notify, which gives you ability to notify the user with a message, and so much stuff. If you'd like to learn more about NeoVim or get your kids started with a terminal text editor, then you'll find links in the show notes. Thanks for watching this episode of This Week in Linux. If you like what I do here on the show, please like that smash button and be sure to subscribe. If you'd like to support the show and the channel, we have multiple ways to contribute via PayPal, Patreon, sponsors, and many others. You can learn more by going to tuxdigital.com/contribute. And if you become a patron, you can join me during the live stream in the recording stadium to discuss stuff between topics and just hang out every week after the show in the patron-only post show. And if you also like to support the channel and the show, you can do so by checking out the DLN store, where you can find the Linux is Everywhere t-shirt, which is a shirt I designed to convey the message that whether or not you know Linux is there, it probably is. That's why it has Tux blended into the background of the shirt. And you can also check out a lot more cool stuff that's at the Destination Linux Network store, or at dlnstore.com. There's tons of great stuff: mugs, hoodies, hats, t-shirts. There's also stickers and aprons and backpacks, all sorts of cool stuff. Check it out, dlnstore.com. And if you also, while you're there at DLN Store, you can check out the rest of the DLN, so that destinationlinux.network. There's so much cool stuff. So if you like more podcasting goodness from me, then check out the latest episodes of Destination Linux and Hardware Addicts, as I'm a co-host of both of those shows on DLN, as well as their great stuff like DLN Extend, Pseudo Show, and so much more. Check it all out at destinationlinux.network. And just a reminder, this show is live every Saturday at 1 p.m. Eastern or 1700 UTC, so join us in the live chat room to discuss all the latest Linux GNews each and every week by going to dlnlive.com. Thanks again for watching. I'm Michael Tennell with Destination Linux Network, and as always, keep using, learning, and enjoying Linux. And I'll see you next week for another episode of your weekly source for Linux GNews.